What brought you to IT law?
It's a terrible mistake. Genuinely. So normally law trumps, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever environment you're in, if a lawyer says you can't do that, that's normally enough. And it wasn't that kind of environment. I ended up being the right person. At the same time, nobody expected me to get into open source. On the record as not being keen on the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. I'm not overly keen on the AI Act. And I'm even less keen on seeing the Product Liability Directive coming down the line in Europe. I think Europe's got it wrong. And it's clearly been done for a reason. I don't know what that reason is. I've not been involved enough, but I do think it's a mistake.
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is freedom.
Open source is great collaboration.
Open source is good engineering.
Open source is community.
Open source is interesting.
Open source is the future.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Let's start recording. This sounds like fun.
Amanda, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what do you do now?
Thanks very much for having me along. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm a CEO at OpenUK. I've been in that role, incredibly to me actually, for just over 4 years now. And before that, I spent 25 years as a lawyer. I'm Scottish, and I guess I studied law in Scotland, the US, and then England, but ended up as an English lawyer and spent about 20 years actually in companies, giving legal advice, managing and running legal teams. And back in 2008, joined a company called Canonical, which many of you will know. I was employee, I think, 165. And I was the general counsel there. So I ran the legal function for 5 years and sort of really got involved in open source from there.
We usually don't have a lot of lawyers on the podcast. So I'm curious.
Come on, be honest. This is the first lawyer we've had on the podcast.
Yes. It's not a bias, is it? Am I still a lawyer? I keep telling people I'm an ex-lawyer, but I'm not sure if you can ever be an ex-lawyer. I'm definitely an ex-solicitor. I'm not a solicitor, the equivalent of an attorney anymore. Definitely not. But I don't know if you can be an ex-lawyer.
What brought you to IT law?
It's a terrible mistake. Genuinely. So I wanted to be an IP lawyer, and I had studied entertainment law. I actually studied entertainment law at NYU with a chap called Victor Kaufman, who founded TriStar Movies, in a group of 12 people, right? So I really wanted to be an entertainment lawyer. And I'd grown up with Ewan McGregor, the actor, who tried to get me to act as a very junior, what we call a trainee here. So my first 2 years of, out of law school, tried to get me to act for a production company he was setting up with Sean Pertwee and... my God, what's the actor called? Talented Mr. Ripley. What's the British actor called? Jude Law.
Jude Law, yeah.
Yeah, so he tried to get me to come and be their lawyer, but my law firm wouldn't let me because they told me actors had no money. So that was my dream career. And then I went for an interview as an IP lawyer, and the lady who interviewed me kept saying IT, and I kept correcting her and saying IP, and then she would say IT. And I really liked her, and it was a very entrepreneurial environment for a lawyer. And when the contract offer came out, it said IT lawyer. And I thought, I've had this really bad experience of computers. We can talk about that. But I've had this really bad experience of computers today. I think I was 26 at this stage. And I'm like, well, I'd do it, won't I? And in the end, I decided to go with it, thinking that it would say IT, but I could probably make it into IP over time. And obviously it went in the other direction. And they very kindly sent me to Queen Mary, the college in London, part of University of London, part-time, and let me do a master's in IT and IP law. And that really sort of built up my knowledge and strength. So it's not like I've always been a fraud and not actually learned anything about IT law. I actually did the first internet law course in the UK in 96, I think it was, and became a sort of dot-com lawyer at the end of the 90s and gradually ended up in more mainstream IT.
So you mentioned that you worked for Canonical. Is that where you learned about open source, or was that before then?
So I knew what open source was, I thought, because like many lawyers, particularly, I mean, we're talking sort of 16, 17 years ago, there was a standard clause that people would see in contracts, and it would either be an indemnity about the open source that you were distributing or a prohibition on it back then. So I kind of thought I knew what it was, and I could have given you a legal definition. I can't promise you that it would have said open source had to be on an OSI license, but it would definitely have said the source code was freely available. So I thought what it was, but I knew what a lawyer from the outside world thought it was. And I certainly didn't know, not so much that I didn't know, I was certainly very far away from what I learned it was within Canonical. And I had some really great teachers, some of them expected, some of them unexpected. So there's a guy called Matt Zimmerman, there's a guy called Matt Zimmerman, MDZ, who is in the Bay Area now, who was, critical on Debian and Ubuntu. And he was tasked with teaching me. So he used to sit me in a room and explain things. And I can remember in the first 6 months actually having a headache, which I never get, but I had a headache because I was trying to work out dynamic and static linking and the impact of what they called viral effect of copyleft licensing. And it was just like too much. And now it's something that, I wouldn't think twice about. And if somebody didn't understand it, I'd be confused that they didn't understand it. But it was tough. And it was tough partly because there was a lot to learn, but also in an environment like Canonical, it was the first place I'd ever been that had been engineer driven. So your CEO, your CFO, everybody around you comes from an engineering background, and normally law trumps, right?
Mhm.
Whatever environment you're in, if a lawyer says you can't do that, that's normally enough. And it wasn't that kind of environment. You really had to justify why, and you can't justify things if you don't understand them. So I really had to learn about this open source stuff and about communities. And I can remember panicking seeing things going out in the public in an open way because they weren't the kind of things the legal team would normally allow into the public domain, and basically being told to back off. And it was me that had to do the learning. And that sort of played out as being a learning about unlearning. So all the stuff that you're taught about control and management and protection as a lawyer to do well in a business and to manage a legal function well, you've sort of got to unlearn to transition into this modern world of collaboration. And that was difficult for me, sitting there all day, every day for 6 months. So I could only imagine when people are, they've got a busy workload and that's one of many, many different things they're looking at, how hard it is to really learn that. And I really try hard not to forget that. And then I also had some sort of acts of great kindness where there were a small group of lawyers. There was a Free Software Foundation Europe had a thing called the Legal Network, and the first event I went to had about 40 people at it in Amsterdam, and Shane Coughlin was the coordinator. He now runs OpenChain. And I think there were very few women, if I think back on it as well, but there were about 40 people. I think everybody was white as well, even worse. But there was a small group of lawyers there, a guy called Malcolm Bain in Spain, Andrew Katz in the UK, Carlo Piana in Italy, and they kind of took me under their wing and they helped me understand the legal issues. And Canonical enabled some funding for some stuff, and we did some projects. One of them was a risk grid that looked at contracts and looked at what you would do traditionally in a contract and how open source impact that, so in liabilities and indemnities and things. And I think Andrew Katz still keeps that up to date, something like version 14. But it was basically my learning tool for negotiation and understanding risk. So I was learning how legally people could or manage risk. And then I was learning from the people like Matt Zimmerman, Elmo, a bunch of people across open source, Colin King. There's a whole group of people who were just generally helping me in terms of understanding the open source and the community and how that all worked. And, John O'Bacon was our community manager in Canonical. So John was cutting his teeth in some ways as well. And it was a very collegiate environment. And in all honesty, it's also quite a neurodiverse environment. And it was the first place in my life I'd ever really felt at home. But I had this combination of people around me, in all honesty, largely male, but people around me who were supportive and trying to help me to become that general counsel that Canonical needed. And it was a really interesting experience.
And what year
very
was this again,
eye-opening.
Amanda? When
That
did you start
was
there?
February 2008.
Okay, so had the SCO thing mostly died down by then, or was it still going on?
Still going on, I think, but coming towards an end, if I
Right.
recall rightly. And we still had Grok Law.
Yeah.
Grok Law would share what was going on in that sort of stuff. So that was a learning tool. But
What did you think of Grok Law as far as it's such a I only ask because Grok Law was very unique, and I haven't seen it repeated to the level that it existed, right? As far as talk about a group of people that weren't necessarily developers coming together in force against a common foe. I mean, that was shocking to me.
Yeah. It was all part of a learning of this thing that was just another world. And there was a piece there where when I joined, I had already been like head of legal and things, and I'd worked internationally since 2000. So I was used to the sort of, working with people from other cultures and things. But I had never experienced, obviously, anything quite like what I was going into. And I think that the environment, very collegiate, very helpful. But initially, the reason I worked in Canonical, in all honesty, is that I had cut my teeth in the dot-com boom by moving into a company called Dixon's, electrical retailers in the UK. We had 5 chains. It's much smaller today. We were the biggest seller of computers. We were talking about buying computers earlier. We were the biggest seller in Europe, ahead of MediaMarkt, of computers. And while I'd been there, I was there for 5 years too. I had done a lot of the computer buying, and we were shifting to doing it across the whole of Europe, and we'd internationalized while I was there, and I worked on that. So I did the computer buying for a while with the procurement team, and we had 2 OEM brands, own equipment manufacturer brands, Advent and Patriot. And those had enabled me to work with some of the suppliers in Asia who built OEM. And I'd worked with Apple as a supplier before Apple had stores, and all the different computer manufacturers back in the day. But what it meant was in Canonical, they were trying to work out how to put Ubuntu on Dell. And they were talking to other people, it's no secret now, it's all been done and dusted like HP and things back before HP split. But the big one was Dell, I think. And I joined, meant to be there for 3 months to scope out what they needed and then leave. And I was going to join Amazon, interestingly, to work on what I think would have been the Kindle, their first electrical retail product. And in the end, I didn't do that, and I stayed at Canonical. And I think they offered me the role within 6 weeks. And it wasn't because I was so brilliant. It was because I had understanding and knowledge of that OEM market that really helped in understanding the negotiations and just what you needed to do to make it work. So for me, the interaction of putting an OEM and putting Ubuntu on a desktop is largely why I ended up being the right person. At the same time, nobody expected me to get into open source. If you were to ask Shuttleworth, I don't know if he'll remember, but you could probably have knocked him over with a feather if you told him that this lawyer he brought in to do corporate commercial, run legal. I think it was always expected. And I brought somebody in to do licensing within 6 months because I didn't have the skills. But I think it was always expected that I would be sort of somebody sitting above that, doing the corporate commercial, and the open source people would be different. And it is probably one of the biggest things that happened in the whole of my life. Because when I look back on my career now, I've spent about 15 years working in open source, 5 years at Canonical, 2 years in a law firm afterwards, 4 or 5 years with OpenUK. And then I've done bits and pieces around the community in between times when I've been in other roles. So there's 15, 16 years of my life. And also, I was a lawyer for 25 years. So 7 of those 25 years doing nothing but open source. So, that's like a third of my legal career, nearly a quarter to a third of my legal career. And then I guess I've worked for 30 years. So almost half of my entire career has been around open source. I can't code, but it's just having that experience, having that engagement and interaction and finding somewhere I felt I fitted. Which is probably quite straight. I doubt many women would have turned around and said, I've joined this canonical Ubuntu crowd and I fit. Because when you look back on what it was at the time, I'm not sure if any of the core engineers were women. When I look back, people like Alison Randall came in later, who was obviously very involved in OpenStack as well. But I just don't, no, it was incredible, really.
Yeah, and I think one thing that Ildiko and I have seen is people will start in a community that doesn't have these best practices and norms, and because that was their first experience, that's what they think it's like. And so they'll move on to another ecosystem, and if there isn't anybody else that's able to change, say something different, they'll actually feel as though they'll take a leadership role and say, well, this is how it's done. It's like, and so they propagate that bad behavior. And it's difficult for communities to succeed in those environments, at least in my experience.
And when you're talking about bad behavior, you're talking about the technical hygiene and the practices, right? You're not talking about people flaming each other. You're talking about
correct. I'm talking, yeah, exactly. It's like I've seen communities where users will come on with no developers and set requirements and expect somebody else to write the code for them that they're going to take and use for free, and that's not the way an open source community works. It's for me, open source is not a end solution. It is a tool. It is a widget into which you build a solution out of. And so, open source being, developed by developers for developers is where I've seen it work well. And there are a variety of ecosystems, like I said, where that hasn't been the norm.
I've been thinking a bit about that. Yeah, I don't know that I've necessarily got a very clear answer conclusion for you yet, but there will be a lot of requirement coming out of the regulatory approach that we're starting to see from Europe in particular. The US was driving on security. I think I'm glad that they haven't quite got to legislation yet because they're really thinking it through. I'm on the record as not being keen on the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. I'm not overly keen on the AI Act. And I'm even less keen on seeing the Product Liability Directive coming down the line in Europe. I think Europe's got it wrong. Doesn't mean it's irreparable, that they can't change things over time, but I think they've got it really wrong in understanding how technology's developed and evolved.
What concerns you most about the CRA? That's sorry to dig in a little bit there.
I think in the initial draft, I've worked around policy since the 90s. I don't know if that's something that would be obvious because in my legal roles, I've worked on very cutting edge stuff and represented my organizations, my companies, and being part of industry organizations and trade bodies and things, lobbying government around. Back in the 90s, it was the distance selling directive, e-commerce directive. And I always try to take a sort of strategic big picture view when you look at law in the early stages. When I was looking at the CRA a year ago, one of the 3 things that really worried me was the fact that they were treating software as a product. And software is a service generally in legislation, not a product, not a good. It's not tangible. And it's been treated as a service. And that in many ways allows for it to be a living, not quite breathing, but mercurial thing that flows and changes, right? Which is really important in an open source environment, in my opinion.
Agreed.
And which creates a lot of good practice, a lot of the bug fixes, the constant, releasing and updating and fixes that you wouldn't have had historically around the proprietary movement you see in the open source movement because of the way that it flows. So I think there's a fundamental shift I don't know if it's a lack of understanding, but it's a shift that Europe has adopted, which will come into the Product Liability Directive as well as the CRA. And I just think it's wrong. It's an approach of making software a product, and now we see the term manufacturer. I mean, software isn't manufactured. It's just not. And if you try to take things, I think what they've done is they've used first movement, which is a fundamental principle. Now I'm being a boring lawyer. Maybe you can't ever stop somebody being a lawyer. But if you take that free movement, or first distribution of goods and services, free movement of people type approach to software going into Europe, you make the first distributor liable. It may, as it does in the Act, have a trigger on commercialization. So you have to distribute and commercialize to be liable, even if you're doing open source. And I think there's the product piece and this concept of product and manufacturer, and then aligned to that sort of certification and trying to build standards around it and treat it as a thing you can stamp at a moment in time. I think it's just all wrong. And I don't think it will build a healthy digital sector in Europe, which is their goal.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a piece around how difficult it already is to build businesses around your open source innovation and to ensure that you can commercialize. Now, I very much agree that foundations shouldn't be liable for code that's open source. And I think the steward exemption that they've managed to create is a great thing. But I think there's a real problem there where it's going to mean it's very hard to distribute code into Europe that's not in a foundation, unless you are able to take on risk. And again, from a lawyer's perspective, what risk is it's about liability and funds. And the liability, to stand the liability, to be able to be liable for something, you need to have money or access to insurance, and insurance costs, and it's not always available. But what a lot of people probably who listen to this won't understand is that many of the big companies that, Phil, you've worked in, I've worked in, they self-insure. They don't buy insurance. They've got enough money, they can put money in a pot to cover what they estimate their risk could be. And that's all done in a very structured way, but they release the money back if there are no claims, if there's no litigation, which means that it doesn't really cost them over time and they can afford to do that. And that risk management and liability is something that small organizations can't do in the same way. And I think that there will be a net consequence, maybe I'll be wrong, but I think there'll be a net consequence of the Cyber Resilience Act where there is less innovation in Europe. People are reluctant to put their innovation into Europe because it will impact their liability and risk, and that we'll see lock-in become common because it will be the big techs and in particular, the systems integrators, the Fujitsus, the SAPs, the IBMs, the Oracles, who are able to distribute small people's code, small companies, individuals' code into Europe. And it's the lock-in that they're trying to get away from. I think they're actually going to promulgate. Because people won't be able to take risk on, but those companies will on a sort of aggregated basis. And it's exactly back to where we were around 2010 in the UK. I was on an advisory board in the Cabinet Office when we came up with the UK's open source first strategy, which was intended to remove some of that lock-in. And public sector governments, they use open source, unfortunately, generally to create code that will be recycled and reused, but also to remove lock-in. But that's usually financially driven, which is why I'm saying unfortunately. I think that's shifting and they're understanding the quality of the innovation and things more now. But there is a real issue here. And I think it is only going to get worse as you see the CRA move to the Product Liability Directive. And I think some of the approaches are also reflected in the AI Act. And it's clearly been done for a reason. I don't know what that reason is. I've not been involved enough, but I do think it's a mistake. And it fundamentally comes back to that single thing, which is recharacterizing software as a product and creators of software as manufacturers or stewards if they've got the foundational carve out. I just think it's wrong.
But yeah, and as we know, the vast majority of open source projects aren't under a foundation. And
no, and we're going to have to see a lot of foundations being set up in order to take all projects, because people are not going to be able to manage their software themselves. So I don't quite know how that's going to work. And, building foundations isn't easy. And I've always dissuaded people from setting up more, but I think that's going to have to shift. And then you're sort of looking at, a problem that's going to be endemic, because when we talk about innovation and we look at how companies are built and scale, they get bought. And they get bought by the big tech companies because they find it hard to innovate, no matter how hard they try with sandboxes. And again, we've been in some of these. It's difficult for them, and they want a healthy pipeline of innovators bringing this stuff out. So it's not good for them either. So I'm not sure, other than possibly the system integrators, who in the ecosystem benefits from this. So maybe they've influenced Europe, I don't know, but I just don't understand who benefits other than them with the changes in the law. I really hope that the UK and others don't follow the same direction. I think there's one other problem with it, which is that historically liability sits with the user. And I'm talking about business users, right? So if I'm a healthcare provider, if I'm a finance provider, I'm regulated. And I've got a whole bunch of laws that whatever digital tools I use, I have to make sure that I'm complying within those tools. If I'm doing general business, I'm not subject to the same regulations. So I'm liable for how I do this. I'll do a contract with whoever provides this for me. If I'm taking open source, I may not have that. I just take it and use it, but I'm responsible for working that out. I'm responsible for curation. If I don't know what I'm doing, I have to buy in skills, or I have to contract with somebody else to do it, right? I either get a company or I bring people into my organization. And, generally, I think we're starting to refer to that as curation. There's a shift now where the supplier is liable under the law. And the supplier used to only be liable under the contract, not under law. It'd be the end user who was, the business user who was creating products and using it be liable. And I also think that's wrong. There's no more, it's all right, I'm not going to go, and another thing. But, this is really where I think they've got it wrong. And I hope we don't go the same way, because ultimately at the moment, what's happening here is our lawmakers are saying this is really hard with things like AI. We're not quite sure what to do with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to push this out to the Information Commissioner, the Financial Conduct Authority, so that the regulators who do that regulatory stuff here are making regulations so it stays the same way, where it is the end user and just not the commercial supplier of software who is liable. Now, some of that will be passed back to the commercial suppliers in the contracts, but without a contract, it doesn't get passed back. Now, the key to that is money changes hands. So if you're expected to be liable, you are definitely going to be paid for that liability. And I don't think that's what's going to happen in Europe. I don't think that's the way the landscape plays out. You might be making some money in your software because you're providing services and things, but it's not the same scale as you would be if you had a proper commercial contract to do a big, proprietary distribution or something.
Right.
So it's difficult. Is that really tedious? Sorry. It's all the lawyers speak. That's why you don't have lawyers on the show very often.
No, it's not a perspective that I've heard.
I think there's one of the problems we've got is policy and open source, right? Because suddenly it's so important in our digital infrastructure that all the governments rightly are starting to go, okay, so what do you mean? The two guys and is it two, or a person in Nebraska? A person in Nebraska is responsible for this and it's holding up the whole world. How does that work? We have to fix this. And they're just trying to get their heads around it, which is absolutely fair and reasonable. And they need to manage somewhere, because somebody somewhere is going to be liable. That's life. That's how, so that's how the landscape works, because it's business. But it's who should be and how they should be and what's appropriate and how you manage that needs to be worked out. And for the open source communities, there's a problem, because the foundations, dealt with the CRA and really led a lot of the challenge, and they've managed to get a steward concept, which I'm really pleased about. But it doesn't necessarily seem to me like the individual developers who commercialize and small businesses or innovators who are going to grow the next HashiCorp and grow a big business. It doesn't seem to me like they're that anybody's really represented them well in this conversation.
Yeah,
and there aren't enough people. It's the people who understand it work in the big companies and can't do this. So people with my skill set would generally be in, a big tech company or a commercial organization. They wouldn't be representing the open source development community or the SMEs. And I don't know how we shift that. And ultimately, rightly, the foundations will have to, protect their own interests versus those. So there needs to be a way, and I don't know the answer yet, that we do what we've done for OpenUK by creating sort of a policy-focused organization that's broad, that also brings together the community. But we need to think about how we do that on a more global basis, I
larger
think.
scale. Yeah.
When it comes to the CRA and PLD, there's kind of a hope that it might kind of shift the mindset of corporations to say that maybe it's time to get involved and actually work on the software that they are using, because up until today, there's still a lot of we are just conscious or unconscious users of open source software. I grabbed the package, the library, the ISO, the whatever from somewhere because it was free. And that's where the involvement ends, that I'm aware I'm using it, and that's all. So not participating in the maintenance. So there's kind of a hope with the CRA and PLD that it might shift the mindset towards maybe this is the time to get involved in maintenance. Do you think that it might have that effect, or it will go a different way?
I think there's a piece where it's like, but you've provided me with this, you need to maintain it. I think that I'm not sure. I hope that you are suggesting something that will be a reality, but my experience is that people don't do things that involve money, or businesses don't do things that involve money unless they have to. And maintaining has a cost to it, right? So companies that currently participate in open source don't do it out of benevolence. I think we have to be really clear on that. People do it because ultimately, if you're in a company, the single requirement that is universal for companies is the generation of shareholder value. That is their purpose. They are not there for other reasons at the moment. And I suspect we will see that shift. Whether it's in my working career or later, I don't know, but I suspect we'll see a more balanced set of requirements on companies over time. And, employee well-being and things will become part of and sustainability will become part of the things. But right now, there is a single requirement in all companies. And what you see is across companies, people, rightly, because this is their job, doing what generates that value. Now, if that value comes from open source, that's why they're contributing to open source projects. So HP, when you were there, Phil, was not doing open source for the good of its health, right?
Never.
Well, anybody, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, everybody we talk about who, all the banks that are moving to open source, they're not doing it because they're hobbyists. They're doing it because it's good for business, because it is the best way to generate technology. And I think that's the message that we are not getting through to the policymakers and the governments. That you do have this hobbyist layer, then you have a business layer, and then you have a significant global end user population who are using it for enterprise, using it for our national infrastructure and our critical infrastructure, because it is the best thing that we have got. Now, whether it will be in 10 or 20 years, who knows, but right now it is. So what we have to do is build understanding and not regulate it out of existence or squeeze those who innovate into such a tight corner that they're not able to. And getting that message across is quite hard. Sometimes when I speak to policy people, I explain tech as a pizza. And I've got to that level because I've gone through many iterations of explaining things and people don't get it. And if I explain to them it's like a pizza, and you go to a restaurant, when you get there, what people do is choose the toppings. Very rarely they discuss the base. And your toppings are like AI, the ML, blockchain, the cloud, the internet. Those are your toppings, but sitting underneath it is this universal base that is largely open source. And if you take it away, you've got a sloppy mess. Now, when I explain it like that, people who are on the policy level in some places get it, but would not get any more nuance than that, at least in the early stages. Now, that's the level we have to take our messaging back to if we want to have impact.
For me, another interesting nuance is, and quite frankly, I'll blame the open source community and the open source developers for this. Even at HP and even at other large organizations that invest in open source, they often are investing in the features that they're looking for. And somewhere along the line, those well-intended, extremely competent developers care about their community, their tribe that they've built. And so they do work reviewing others' codes, providing comments and suggestions, and all of the maintainer activity that's required that they're not getting paid for. And they do it for a number of years, and they ultimately, particularly as we've now been in a place where security is more important, there are more requirements. You've got arbitrary people fuzzing your code, sending in all kinds of additional change requests because of these and bug reports because of the tools that they've been running. And it's creating a larger cast of activities that are required by those maintainers that they're also not getting paid for. And that's part of the underpinning of the burnout that we're hearing about. So even in those situations, we have this lack of well, it's a lack of resources, right? Which is always the case, but we're having it in that foundation of the pizza.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and everything from XZ to, every time I go to an open source summit, there's always the report by Jonathan Corbett talking about issues in the kernel. And I'm talking about the kernel, the longest running. These are very well paid developers, but they're not getting paid to do that maintenance activity, and they're frustrated. They're getting burnt out.
Yeah, and it's I'm going to give you a slightly different slant on it. A couple of times recently, I've described myself as a maintainer, and I don't have an output that's a chunk of code that I can show you, but I have an ecosystem that I've brought together that has an impact and that I maintain, and I engage around a broader picture internationally in that scene as well. And even, I don't know, I haven't got a copy to hand, but my stupid book, it's not a stupid book. It's a wonderful book.
I don't think it's a stupid book. It's a great book.
Well, it's a wonderful book that 26 people put a lot of work into creating an incredible content. It's only a stupid book because I had to read it so many times. But that I said I would never do it again. And I'm going to have to. I don't have a choice. I was talking to somebody about that this afternoon. There's some stuff that needs updating. There's no AI chapter. And the security chapter has to reflect the CRA and other stuff that's happening. So, we're just working out how we do that to get it out again, I suspect, probably next summer 25. So there's a solid output that I'm a maintainer of, although I'm not a coder. And that meant that I had 2 weekends I didn't work and no holiday in 2022. Because every time I thought we were done, I ended up spending my holidays doing it. And it's one of those things where, what do? You don't want to let people down. It has to be the right quality. So how do you manage that? And I have a job that I'm paid in, but you work many, many more hours because there's a blurring also between what's your job and what's the stuff that you do in communities, and you build friendships with people who are in those communities, but then you go out for a drink or dinner and all you talk about is work. So it's a really tricky path to walk to be part of that open source ecosystem. And I don't know whether in 20 years, if open source survives in 20 years, whether we'll have got better at this or whether we will still be talking about the difficulties, because it's very hard to disengage from it, right? Because you are with other people and doing things for the collective that you want to be that high standard. And you all want it, you all want that polished, finished product that serves you all well. So it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 things I would highlight from this conversation. One is that the for developers by developers, that one has to go. It's not accurate anymore. Not everybody's a developer, and it comes up in so many conversations, and
If
people
you
are
want
like,
documentation, Ildiko, read the code. Come on, this
right?
is how it works.
Yeah, but then there's user experience, and then there's,
Lawyers.
diagrams, the lawyers, the licenses, the policies. There are so many things that's not a developer thing. They will not work on it, and it's not for them all the time. Yeah. So that's one thing where I think there's some more evolution is about to come. And the other thing is, though, I think, Amanda, you mentioned that maintenance is cost. Like if a company gets involved in an open source project to maintain, then it's a cost, which is true. It's true. In itself, it's a true statement. But on the other hand, if they are using that open source software, they are doing maintenance no matter what. And if they are doing that maintenance downstream and never participate in the community to do it, it actually becomes more costly than doing it upstream in the first place. And I don't know if it's going to be the CRA or something else that just turns on the light bulb that there's always maintenance cost. And that's what I never understood, and I still don't understand when companies. I used to work for Ericsson, and I was paid to do some open source work, but on the margins, that on the pieces that didn't really matter, because then you don't have to think that much about IP, for instance, and all the what's happening with the license, who's liable for what, and let's not break any patents that we have. So I was paid to do some of it, and there were a lot of things that back in the day, I'm talking about 9 years ago, we should have contributed back, and we didn't. The company didn't, and the maintenance of deviating from upstream is just, it becomes insane. And then it becomes so costly that at one point it becomes unmaintainable downstream. So it's nuts, if you ask me. Because yes, there is a maintenance cost if you get involved, but there's an even higher cost if you don't. And there's an
Right.
even higher risk if you
Yeah.
don't.
And I think that we're still evolving understanding what you were saying about the non-code is important in different ways. So it's important in terms of people's respect and recognition for the work they do. But it's also important for companies to understand, because if they don't invest in that broader landscape and they want to use the code and be part of the ecosystem, they're going to have a mess. You need to have that whole ecosystem, including policy people, including document writers, and including translators and DevRel people and the conference organizers and all the people that build an ecosystem to enable. And, you know, some of it we do better than others, and some of it we'll do differently in a couple of years from the way we do it now. But you need an ecosystem that's invested in. I don't know how we get to that, you know, get a better definition of public good and make everybody invest into one big pot and then share it out appropriately. I don't know. But that there needs to be better ways of covering that infrastructure cost. And it's not technical infrastructure, it's human infrastructure. And it's the people who make this tick. So, you know, I think the old Apache way, people over code, we need to recognize that there's a need for many people to do many different roles to enable what used to be done by companies to be done by companies and individuals, and to create that whole network and environment for the future.
Before we depart, can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with law, open source, or tech? Some kind of a fun fact.
Fun fact. Oh my goodness. There's nothing fun about me. I have a terrible sense of humor. What is a fun fact? I have a cat that's actually relatively well known in open source because I got him right before lockdown. And all the way through open source, I had this kitten who used to sort of get to shoulder height all the way through open source, all the way through lockdown. I would do recordings in different parts of my house to, you know, have a change of scene. And I have a sofa that has like this height here. So he would come because I was looking at a screen and look over my shoulder. So he looks like it's a parrot on my shoulder. And this kitten Dundee, this little ginger cat, I live just him and me, and we've lived together for 4 years now. But he actually is probably cited just about as much as I am in open source, because every podcast people go, oh, look at your cat. So I guess I have a cat who knows more about open source than almost any open source expert in the world, is probably my fun fact.
I love
Is
that.
he close to you now? Can we see him? Can you get him on camera?
I'm just thinking I can. Let me just move something so I don't knock it over, because here in the UK, we are getting towards the end of the day. And He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that, I don't know if you can see. Can you see? There is Dundee.
Oh,
Oh yeah.
yes.
Yep. He's
Oh,
Obviously, there's probably loads of mess in my house. Sorry about that. But you are also, that's my ADHD. You're seeing Dundee sitting there, and I've just taken this out, but I've probably caused a problem in the recording too. Are we all back and on the? Yeah,
no,
there
you're
we
all
go.
good. You're all good.
Oh, that's good because I unplugged everything. So Dundee is there dutifully sleeping because he's heard all this before, waiting to have his dinner.
that's so sweet. I love that. I will not crack that joke that were you that lawyer who was yelling on Zoom that I'm not
Oh
a
my
cat,
God,
I'm
I
not a
love
cat.
that. I absolutely, so that was probably, I have an odd sense of humor, but during lockdown, the lawyer and the Texan lawyer who was in court, who had the cat filter that he said his secretary had put on or his EA had put on and couldn't get off. And he kept saying this, Your Honor, I am not a cat. And it's like exactly what someone who was a cat who was pretending to be a lawyer would say. Honestly, I used to turn this on for maybe 2 or 3 weeks and just sit on the sofa and cry with laughter at that cat. I adore that cat who wants to be a lawyer. Absolutely hilarious.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, bullet, but no. Silver budget as well. Silver budget that is a silver bullet.
That's what you need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. Oh, and to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that, I don't know if you